Before we start with this base, let's take a look at its colored pieces. The bottom edges of both the front and back pieces are not left for seams, because this set I made is a method that does not involve gathering. Of course, if you prefer the final inward fold, then you can measure the line and gather it slightly. If you want to incorporate it, you should leave a seam at the bottom edge. Additionally, there is a seam at the opening of the two back pieces. One side is 7 millimeters and the other is 14 millimeters. They differ. The bottom edges of both sleeves also do not have a seam left. It is a method that does not involve incorporation. If you want to take it in, leave a seam for yourself. Next, let's discuss the thread. I have given a reference value for this thread size in the drawing. Fold it in half and iron it. On this side of the opening, we leave a 5 millimeter seam. You can draw the stitching line here. That is, the distance from this side to the stitching line. This is the size that will be exposed at the neckline when we finish. Then we will take a detailed look at the stitching. The front and back pieces are facing each other. First, sew the pointed seam. After sewing, we unfold the front and back pieces. The seams at the pointed position are separated to the sides. Take out the sleeve and fold it in half. Make a mark at the center point. Do the same marking on the other sleeve. Then we sew the sleeve along the curve of the rusty frame. When the sewing reaches the sharp seam position, the marking point we just created, the center marking point should align with it. Continue stitching the remaining part along the curve. Use the same method to attach the other sleeve. After both sleeves are done, we can turn this seam to face one side, then sew a visible line. If you aren't very skilled at sewing visible lines, this step can be skipped. After finishing the visible stitching on both sides, let's now apply the collar's thread. The side of the thread opening should face right. The position of the fold should face left. The fabric underneath is facing up. We will sew directly at the neckline position on the front side of the fabric. The ribbing is slightly shorter than the length of our neckline. When we attach the ribbing, we need to stretch the ribbing part slightly while sewing. Be sure to pay attention to stretching the threaded part above. You shouldn't stretch the fabric of the neckline below as well. If you stretch the fabric at the bottom itself, it can easily lead to problems after finishing sewing. The neckline will end up being very wide and loose. After sewing, flip the thread to the front. Sew the bottom seam to the left. Sew a visible line around the neckline. Then we will combine the two back pieces. The front sides should be facing each other. I mentioned at the beginning the stitching location of the opening at the back of the back piece. One side measures 7 millimeters, while the other side measures 14 millimeters, because the widths of the two back pieces differ. So we need to align the position of this stitching line during the alignment. After alignment, our stitching will be one wide and one narrow. Then sew from the bottom up to the stopping point. You can adjust this stopping point as needed. If you want this garment to fit better, then don't set the stopping point too high. Lower it slightly. After the sewing is done, we split the stitches to both sides. This narrower seam, directly stitch a line on top to secure it. Then handle this wider seam using the initial stitches and threads. This means to use this stitch line as the reference. We align the edge and fold it down this way. Sew a straight line right on top. Secure this position as well. You don't have to start from the bottom when sewing the side seam, because we will trim off the bottom part. You can be around 5 millimeters from this cutoff point. The cutoff point is here, isn't it? We begin measuring the seam about 5 millimeters from it. After measuring, we focus on this bottom part. We'll just trim it off. Be careful not to cut the seams and threads of the two thick pieces we started with. We're just trimming off the excess part of this wide seam. Then we will use the seam we just trimmed, and then layer it onto the seam on the other side. Keep them stacked together. Let's turn it to the front. At this position of the end point, make a short line. This short line is for us to frequently wear and remove. It's difficult to pull apart the thread at the deadline position. Finally, we will sew the sleeves together and the side seams of the front and back panels. Here, we first align the front and back pieces with their right sides together. Then we sew at this spot. The other side is also stitched together. Sew at the same spot, sew along this line. After sewing both sides, make a few cuts on each side. Then we turn the garment right side out, because my hem doesn't need any finishing. So at this point, I've already finished.
Here we're going to make the collar, which consists of 2 layers of fabric. The top layer is this textured fabric, and the bottom layer is a slightly thinner 60 count washed cotton. This edge is left unsewn, while the other areas are sewn along the line. When sewing, both the starting and ending positions should follow this line, leaving a 5 millimeter seam allowance outward. Then, there are a total of 4 corners here where we need to insert the thread to make the edges look more aesthetically pleasing when turned. After measuring along the line, it looks like this. Now we will trim the seam. Because I placed a thread inside, and the position of the thread head is a bit further out, I need to tuck this thread inside in advance. Tuck it in to ensure we won't cut the thread while trimming the seam. Then we can proceed with the trimming. For the unstitched area, we leave a 5 millimeter seam to trim. For the other stitched areas, we can leave about a 3 millimeter seam. Trim the seams at the 4 right angle positions diagonally. Be careful not to cut the threads inside. We have threads placed inside. After trimming, you can simply turn it over. When flipping, be mindful of the threads placed inside. At the same time, pull both ends of this thread outward. Don't pull too hard, the force should be moderate. If you pull too hard, it will get misshapen. After flipping it over, we tidy up and iron it. Those who are skilled in sewing can do it like I do. Sewing a complete circle directly will make the lines smoother. Next, we need to add a support strap, and we can draw the auxiliary line for it in advance. To adjust the size, we draw the line approximately 3 millimeters from the edge. Since I haven't made a large size yet, I'm unsure if I will in the future. If we go with a large size, we can use either 5 millimeters or 3 millimeters. In fact, everyone can adjust this thing moderately. Align the edge of the strap with the auxiliary line's position. We just need to adjust the position of the right angle slightly. Turn it in this direction and attach it. I recommend using a small amount of glue to secure it first. Then we will sew a line to secure it afterwards. Of course, if everyone feels it's all right. You can also sew the line directly to secure it. In any case, I wouldn't recommend relying solely on glue. If you only use glue, it tends to come off easily. However, I didn't sew any more seams this time because I couldn't find thread in the same color family immediately, so I just used glue. Either way, everyone can see the real situation. I'm making the sample outfit a bit more casually here. I recommend that everyone should sew a line first. It will be more sturdy. After the strap is sewn properly, we will draw a style line around the neckline. Draw it on the front side of the fabric. Then this part will be set aside for now. Next, let's create a pocket. For the pocket's outer layer, I used twill fabric. Then we will first draw the pattern on the front, then at the spot you think is appropriate. Sew a support strap onto it. Here I used an adhesive for the support strap. Because I couldn't find thread in the same color scheme right away, I recommend that everyone try to use machine stitching. It will be more secure. Then we flip it over. Trace this pattern on the back side as well, because this fabric is a bit transparent, so I can actually see where the pattern is on the back. But if everyone is using darker fabric, it may be invisible. Then we can't represent it visually directly like this. If we encounter this situation, everyone can use a beading needle for assistance. That is, use a pin to puncture through both ends of the line. Then we make some markers. Finally, we take out this pocket design. Stack these two markers at the ends of the straight line. Trace the pattern along the edge. Then we take a piece of thinner lining fabric. Here I'm using 60-character water wash cotton. Put it under this layer of fabric. This refers to the start and end position. We sew a little further out. You can sew about 1 centimeter. The straight line's position is not stitched. This is how it looks after stitching. Then we'll do some trimming. This part of the straight line is not stitched. We leave a 1 centimeter allowance for the seam. For the remaining areas, we can leave a seam of about 2 to 3 millimeters. The curved areas need to be trimmed with a rotary cutter. If you don't have a rotary cutter, use regular scissors to make some snips. After making the snips, flip it over directly. Organize and smooth out the edges yourself. You can take a look here. The pocket made by this method. The edges with this curve will be more rounded. Then we take this top part. Directly fold it over along this guideline to the back. On the reverse side, you can see that this style is fairly wide because we have left 1 centimeter. The purpose of leaving this much is because we need to fold in this step. In this position, you can leave a bit more room. It will be easier to fold. The zigzag line is also relatively easy to fold. After the line is folded, it looks like this. Then at this point, we will turn to the reverse side. Trim off the excess part a bit. Leave about 2 to 3 millimeters. Then this part will be set aside for now. Let's take a look at our sleeves. I have pressed a layer of lightweight fabric on the sleeves here. The pressing is because I used twill fabric here. It's not the thick type of twill fabric. This time I didn't use an inner measurement for the sleeves. Therefore, the single layer twill fabric is somewhat thin, so I added a lightweight interfacing for ironing. Everyone, take a look at your own fabric. If the fabric you are using is quite thick, then there's no need to press the scale again. If you're using something thinner, you can press it like I do. And I left a bit more fabric at the bottom edge of the sleeves, because if I do the stitching later, it might be about a 0.5 millimeters thread. I might have left a style of around 0.8 here. It depends on the situation for everyone. If you prefer a wider line for the car, just like I do, leave it a bit wider. If you prefer the car to be a bit narrower, in that case, a 5 millimeter seam allowance is sufficient for your style. The hem of our sleeves has a curved shape. When we fold the hem inwards, we need to follow this curve. Alternatively, you can do it the way I do. Align the bottom edge of the pattern with our sewing line. Here, I used a clip for the design, so it has a specific stiffness. Then we fold it upwards like this and iron it. This curve forms very easily. Then we draw a line along the edge to fix it. I'm withdrawing a line of 0.5 here. Everyone can assess their own situation. If you prefer to narrow it down, then narrow it down a bit. Once we have completed the withdrawal, we take out a support strap. The position of the support strap perfectly covers the line measurement. We need to be careful when measuring the seams here. The fabric underneath should be pulled in our direction. Pull it with a bit more force. Because this way, after we finish up, this sleeve won't wrinkle if you don't pull it at all. Ultimately, the area where the strap is attached to the sleeve may end up wrinkling. Only pull the fabric at the bottom of the sleeve. Do not pull the strap at the top. After finishing the sleeve, you can wrap it around in a circle like this, because we have completed the sleeve after all. A flat piece. The sleeve is simply a circle. like how I look right now. The fabric underneath doesn't have any obvious wrinkles. That's normal. If, like the previous strap, the fabric wasn't pulled, it's just a normal sewing pass. This fabric underneath has a blood pattern. It will definitely wrinkle up. Everyone should check it themselves. If there are no issues, we will use the same method to attach another strap next to it. Let's first stitch the front and back pieces of the top here. The front piece and the back piece are facing each other. Sew at the pointed seam location. Then sew the inner front and back pieces using the same method. After sewing the pointed seam, spread it to both sides. You can use a steam iron to press it lightly. Let's make this area a bit smoother. In this episode, our sleeves do not have a lining, so here we need to slightly adjust the gathering position inside. For those skilled sisters, you can directly tuck this design inward. This is how to stitch the inner fold. Make some cuts. For beginner friends, I recommend following my video for guidance. Here we cut a piece of lightweight interfacing. Position this area to align with the front of the repair. Be aware that one side of the fusible interfacing is adhesive. We will make it smooth. The side that is not sticky will be designated as the front. If you don't have fusible interfacing and don't intend to purchase it, you can directly use a piece of this copper-colored lining fabric. It's the same. The benefit of using fusible interfacing is that after we complete the work, we can press it slightly. This can adhere the interfacing to the fabric. If they are fused together, it will definitely look smoother and more attractive. Once the position is set, we will directly sew along the design line of the embroidery frame. After sewing, use lace to trim the edges. We don't have any decorative scissors, so just use regular scissors. Make some snips in the curved areas. Next, we will take this interfacing fabric. Flip it to the back of the lining fabric. You can use the curling iron to warm it up a little. You can also scrape it with your nails like I do. If you're using the curling iron, make sure to be careful. Only heat this small part at the folding area. Don't heat too deep inside. Wait a moment for this excess fusible interfacing. We still need to trim it off. After folding it properly, we will cut it about 1 millimeter along the edge, cut it to the marking line, fix this in place. After removing it properly, the excess interfacing on both sides here can be trimmed off. Then flip it to the other side, leave about a 5 millimeter seam. Trim off the excess parts as well. Then we use a curling iron. Give this part a slight curl. In this step, we will see the use of interfacing. This is a difference when using regular fabric, because if you use interfacing, we'll press it like this, it bonds with the fabric underneath, it will be smoother. Finally, after we complete the entire garment, regarding the direction of the lining, it actually appears like this. It falls down like this. If we look from the perspective of the lining decor, this position will be very clean. Of course, if you don't like this method, you can also use other methods, or you can add a lining to the sleeves. That's also fine. If any sisters are unsure, feel free to message me privately. Here, we will attach the collar. Before we attach the collar, we will first work on the front side of this fabric. Let's trace the stitching line around the collar. This area has a corner that is indented. It's located right here in this section of our fabric. Then when we put on the collar, the edge should align here. This is on the other side of the collar. Align the edge position with this recessed corner. Then let's fold the collar in half first. Make a mark at the center of the collar opening. Fold the back piece in half as well. Make a mark at the center of the back piece as well. When we attach the collar, these two marked points need to be aligned. At this point, our collar and the fabric underneath are all facing up. Then from what we discussed earlier, there is a dented section here. At this point, begin the side stitching. It looks like this after sewing. Then we are at this position. We need to attach this pocket to it. The position of the pocket, it's likely at the pointed corner of our collar. It should be about 2 or 3 millimeters away from it. Press a visible line directly at the edge. Secure it in place. This is how it looks after finishing the pocket. Then we will use the prepared front piece. The decorative part and the watch part are stacked face to face. There is a corner down here at the front. We're about 2 centimeters away from it. Start sewing the side seam, sew all the way to the other side, also about 2 centimeters away from the foot next to it. This is where you start stitching. Follow this line around the neckline. Stitch all the way to this point here. When you stitch around the neckline, pay attention. We have the thread gauge for the collar we just attached, the point where we insert the needle. It can be on this circle. The position beside it is about 1 millimeter. After sewing at this location, it won't be able to see it. The stitch we made earlier. Or you are confident in this stitch. It's also fine to say that the car is just right. Anyway, just don't go to the left. Because if you turn left, it means that after the line is completely turned over, it will be exposed. Also over here, you can see there are 4 corners here. Here is 1, here is 1, there's 1 over here, and here's the last one over here. We can insert a wire into each of these corners. This will look more aesthetically pleasing after flipping it over. Once it's properly supported, it looks like this. Then let's trim the seams a bit. At this right angle position, we'll trim the seams at an angle like this. There is a place for the thread inside. Be careful not to cut the thread. The stitching at this corner next to the collar, we can also trim it at an angle like this. And there's a dented corner here, right? Make a straight punch into the cut like this. There's excess seam next to it. You can also cut it off. But everyone needs to be careful. Be careful not to cut into the trap. Then use the pinking shears. Trim the neckline a bit. If you don't have pinking shears, just use regular scissors. make more cuts in the curved areas. This is what the neckline looks like after making the cuts. Then we will set the embroidery frame for the front part. Unfold the front and back pieces. Let's attach the sleeves. Let's discuss the sleeves again here. This is the sleeve. If you're using the same fabric as I am, this thinner twill fabric, I suggest you give it a little press. I forgot to press it while filming this video. Later, I disassembled it and pressed it again. Then pay attention. Our sleeve has a front and back. It's not only the position marked as back, we will sew it together with the back piece. The position marked as front. Just like stitching the front panel together. Be mindful of the direction. Stitch the sleeves. We simply sew along this seam line vertically. Stitch following this curve. Adjust the curve while sewing. If sewing directly like this isn't accurate, you can use a bamboo needle to secure it first. Or you can first use a hand sewing needle to make a few stitches. Then continue stitching. Then repeat the method we just did, like the sleeve on the other side. After finishing the sleeve, we will align the front and back pieces of the lining facing each other. Sew the side seam at the bottom of the armhole. The other side is also facing the same way, with the fronts together. Sew the side seam here. Next, place the front and back pieces of the outer layer together, facing each other. Sew the side seam of the sleeve, and this side seam of the front and back pieces. Then join the front and back pieces on the other side. And so the scarf I'm using here is made of this thinner, lightweight fabric. The dimensions given on the drawing already include the seams. No extra needs to be added. We'll cut it directly according to the dimensions on the drawing. Then we'll unravel the threads at both ends like this. The flow rate is approximately 1 centimeter. Both ends have to be disassembled. Everyone can simply repeat it themselves. Create a design like this with a ribbon underneath the scarf. This is what we conclude with our scarf. There's no need to sew buttons or anything like that anymore. You can secure it directly. First, let's take a look at the final stitching. The stitching position is here. This line is for stitching. Certainly the position of our seam, in fact, it can be positioned in the middle. It can also be placed like this on the side. For instance, if you say the seam is perfectly centered, that means regarding our strap, it will come at the very end. In other words, after we finish everything at the end, you may need to do some hand sewing. In other words, if I have seams built up like this is the position I mean right now. The position we will operate on later will be more appropriate. We can start at this edge position. Let's draw a line on it. This is on the front side of the fabric. It's approximately 1 centimeter from the edge. This strap, when we sew it later, will just be resting on this line. Then there's this line written on our drawing, which says a few centimeters from the edge. For example, I wrote that it's 4 centimeters from the edge. Then we'll mark this position at 4 centimeters. Make a mark. The fabric I am using, the lines it draws are not very clear. In any case, it's at the 4 centimeter position. Everyone should make their own mark. Then there's another sentence on the back of our drawing. In other words, how many centimeters to the left? For example, I wrote to move 2.7 centimeters to the left. So we will use the mark we just made. Move left another 2.7 centimeters. Make another mark. Now this position I'm pointing at with 2 fingers, this is the position of the 2 marked points. Take out our support strap, place it at the position of the first marking point. Directly place the needle at this position. Then fix this part. After securing it, take a look. This is where I place the needle. This is our marking point, and on the left side, there's a seam. Then we will trim this seam a little, just leave about 2 centimeters. Then fold the strap over to the left like this. About 2 centimeters away from the edge, draw a line. It perfectly hides the seam below. Once measured, let's take a look. Here's another marker point. We need to fold this strap like this. Fold it down for measurement. If you think this position is not suitable for sewing, you can sew a few stitches by hand. It will be easier to sew. Take a look after the test. I just tested this position below. There was no vehicle reaching the upper line. Then this support strap at the very top. It has a certain amount of space, it's not completely flat. Then we trim off the excess part at the bottom. We can leave about 2 centimeters. Then we take the strap, we also press it down to flatten it out to the side, about 2 centimeters from the inner edge. Sew a short line on it. Secure this part. This way we've managed this position. Then we will fold this scarf in half. The side that is folded in is the front of the fabric. The side facing up now is the back of the fabric. Then the area we are sewing here is nesting. There's no need to sew the fringed part. We begin sewing past this part of the fringe, starting from here to the end. This section also does not require the vehicle's flow tassel. This is what it looks like after the vehicle is ready. We leave a 0.5 margin from the edge for the sewing of the vehicle. Then we use the hemostatic forceps to flip it over. We don't have hemostatic forceps. You can also use other small tools. This scarf is quite wide. I also have difficulty flipping it. After flipping it over, we adjust the position of the strap to the center, smooth it out a bit. Then the scarf goes around the child's neck. Wrap it around like this. Then you can pass it through the strap over here. Different doll heads may lead to different outcomes. After we have tied the scarf, the effect of its length is different. For instance, there might be more dolls with big heads now, if they all have big heads, but this face shape is a bit rounder. Some face shapes are slightly thinner. The chubbier one has a thicker area around this spot. Then, this is the length of the scarf you need. It just needs to be a bit longer. Otherwise, this loop will end up being too tight. It will just make the scarf look too short. Anyway, everyone can adjust it based on the circumstances. Then make some more adjustments to the length. You can also customize it to your liking. Add some decorations to it. Today I'm filming a video on making socks. First, let's discuss the fabric used for the socks. The socks must be made from knitted fabric. Cotton fabric cannot be used. Cotton fabric has no elasticity. It won't fit well when made. You should also pay attention to the choice of knitted fabric. It's fine if it's for making slouch socks. But if you make socks that fit the legs properly, the elasticity is too great. It will be a bit loose. If the elasticity is too low, you might not be able to put them on. So this is a fabric issue. You can also choose according to your needs. Additionally, we should pay attention to the direction of the fabric. You can see it when you get close. It has a vertical texture on it. At this moment, we handle it like this. It only has elasticity when stretched horizontally. So when we draw the sock pattern, this fabric needs to be drawn in a vertical direction. Here we first draw on the front side of the fabric. Draw a horizontal line at the topmost position. We will fold and finish the edge of this line shortly. This is the edge at the top of our sock. Next, we will sew at this position. I left quite a lot. At least I think we should leave around 1 centimeter. Leave some extra fabric when sewing. We can trim after we finish measuring. Now let's officially start sewing. First, fold this position inward toward the back side. Start with 2 back stitches. Then we stop. Here we need to use our hands to stretch the fabric. That is, stretch it in your direction. Stretch while sewing. This way, the elasticity at this position will remain. If you drive a flat car over it, then the elasticity at this position will be fixed by your sewing thread, resulting in difficulties when we put it on and take it off. This position can't be lifted up. So when we sew the garment, be sure to pay attention to pulling this position apart from the car. It's okay if there are some wavy edges after finishing. This is normal. Once we finish, there won't be any wavy edges. Next, we will trim the excess material at the back. Just leave about 3 millimeters. After trimming, take out the sock's blueprint. At the left side of this reverse side, draw this sock. The sock blueprints I normally provide are always half-sized. We only need to draw half. After drawing, fold it along this straight line. Then we start sewing up along the line from the bottom. Don't rush to trim after measuring. Let's take a look at this position. This is the line we initially drew as a horizontal line. And this is the line from the socks we just stitched. The intersection of the 2 lines goes to this point outside the seam. We will perform 2 back stitches at this position. The purpose of this step is to prevent wear from frequently putting on and taking off socks. This area is unraveled, because if we do it my way, we will finally finish trimming the socks. The stitch count at this position is not fixed. After finishing the back stitches, leave about a 3 millimeter margin when cutting the socks. After cutting, turn the socks right side out. Everyone can tidy them up and give them a light iron. And that's how the socks are finished. Here we're discussing how we typically make clothes. We often encounter certain positions. It has an angle. So how should we handle the position of such angles to make it look more aesthetically pleasing when flipped? The shape of such angles is not necessarily a right angle. It could also be an acute angle or an obtuse angle. Let me roughly sketch it out. When we usually encounter this kind of position, its angle size may vary, but we can all use the same method to manipulate it. Then flip it over. Prepare a sewing thread. This is the thread we usually use for a regular sewing machine. I personally suggest that the color of this thread should be quite different from the color of the fabric. For example, I am using white fabric here. Then you should stop using white thread, because it's easy to flip the fabric over. You might mistakenly think this is the thread end and either pull it off or cut it. Then when we begin sewing, you'll soon reach this corner. Stop at the place 1 stitch in front of it. After stopping, we open the 2 pieces of fabric, place the thread in the middle position, pull both ends of the thread back tightly with both hands. At this moment, our needle is pricked into the fabric, so our thread will get caught on the needle. In this state, let's move forward 1 step. You must hit the exact tip of this needle. If there are some sisters you're not sure about, just write. This shot goes to this point, then manually lift the pressing angle. String the hand wheel together, let it be the position of the last stitch. It lands exactly on this sharp point. At this moment, our needle is still in the fabric, then we pull both ends of the thread tight, pull it out slightly, if we've done it correctly. So this thread is already behind the needle. It turns out that just now it was at the front, now it is. The pattern of the upper part of the dress looks like this. There are 2 front pieces and 2 back pieces. Note when we sew the pointed seams, these 2 pieces are sewn together. These 2 pieces are sewn together. This is when we position them face to face like this. The position of the embroidery frame can align together. If you directly place 2 pieces facing the same way together, you will see that the direction is wrong. The 2 embroidery frames face each other in opposite directions. Align the front and back pieces together in the correct direction. Sew them together at the pointed seam positions. After sewing, spread the seam at the pointed position to both sides. Use your nails to scrape or an iron to press this area flat. Then take out 2 pieces of lining fabric. The lining fabric should be just a bit larger than the outer fabric. Place the lining fabric and the outer fabric right sides together. Next, we start sewing from this point. At the edge of the outer fabric, sew upwards along this seam line. Then continue down to the bottom around the neckline. Next, sew along this curve at the position of the embroidery frame. The other piece is the same as well. This position of the embroidery frame follows the thread. The other side also goes up along the thread from the back here. It goes through the neckline down to the front here. If we sew these two pieces together, each will have two corner positions. One is at this opening in the back, this right angle here. The other is at this opening in the front. This is a relatively blunt corner. You can insert a line into the positions of both corners. This way, when we flip it over, it will have a better shape. The method for placing lines is provided separately in the folder. Everyone can take a look first. I'll go ahead and demonstrate here. We won't discuss this method of laying the thread anymore. Next, we embroidered along the side seam of this part. Make sure to hide this thread inside. Do not let the thread shift to the side. After measuring, we should trim off the excess lining fabric. First, we need to insert the thread we placed in for flipping. The areas that were not stitched previously. We will follow the edge of the surface. Trim off the excess inner scale. There was a stitching spot earlier. If there are curved areas, we need to use pinking shears. If there are no pinking shears, just use regular scissors to make some cuts. Next, trim the two corners. Here we will trim the stitching of the shoes. Please note that there is a thread inside. Make sure not to cut that thread. Next, we will flip it over from this side of the back piece. Reach over from the shoulder, pull the lining that is clamped between the front piece back. Pull the head over a little bit. Let's not continue using this purple-blooded clamp. Switch to using your hands, because if you pull hard with the purple pincers, it's easy to rip the fabric. Switch to using your hands and slowly pull it over like this. If your fabric isn't very thick, it should be quite easy to pull it over here. Then we pull both ends of this line tight at the same time. Pull this leg outwards. Just apply moderate force. Don't apply too much force. If you pull too hard, you might end up tightening this part. Then arrange these areas next to it. Give it a light iron, the front and back sections on the other side. Also apply the same method here. After both pieces are completed, this is how it looks. A relatively good model of the marking line machine. You can run the entire marking line from back to front. The other piece also features the marking line in the same position. Then we will stack the front pieces of the two together. The overlap here is approximately 6 millimeters. This is the position. The overlapping area is approximately 6 millimeters. We can stitch it temporarily here. However, due to this position, ultimately it is exposed. If certain fabric spinning, if it leaves pinholes, restoring it becomes quite difficult. Then it doesn't matter if you sew a few stitches. You can start by sewing it a couple of times. The sew it a couple of times is exactly where we're going to attach the button shortly. Explain why you don't sew the button directly in this step. Because some corners are quite sharp. If there's a button here, you won't be able to get past the overpressed corner. After all, we still need to sew it to the skirt hem later. If we hand sew 2 stitches here, we should try to make the thread as invisible as possible, including the thread ends. You can place it between 2 layers of fabric. Just sew 2 stitches right at the button placement. Once you finish sewing. Lastly, we will sew the button on top. Cover this thread with the fabric. Here are the 2 white dots. This is where I just sewed. Finish sewing and pull the needle. Actually, this thread. We can also take it off when we sew on the button at the end. At the bottom seam here, you can sew a few stitches to secure it. Move the sewing position a bit to the right. Just sew a few stitches here quickly. Then we will sew and connect the side seam under the drag and repair. The front and back pieces are unfolded like this and aligned together. Sew along the 5 millimeters edge seam. This side is in the same position as well. After copying it correctly, we will unfold this style and combine it together. Use the same method to work on the other side. This is how it looks after processing both sides. Then this rising part is reserved for later. We created a separate image like this in the file section. This doesn't need to be printed. I printed this out for easier explanation to everyone. The data for each size is different, so you shouldn't refer to my data. You should look at the data on the image in your own tutorial file. We have a total of 7 parts to assemble. Here is 1 part, then here is 1, below here is 1, in the middle here is 1, on top here is 1 below, the one on the far side. The dimensions listed here do not include the allowances. You need to add the allowances yourself. Typically, we add allowances to all 4 edges. However, there is an issue with this bottom edge. I use this fringe treatment for the bottom edge. If it's a fringe treatment, then it doesn't need to be folded and tucked up anymore. If you don't want to do this fringe treatment for your bottom edge, then you would normally leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. Finally, fold it inward and tuck in the edge. Then let's discuss how to create this raw edge. I simply tore the fabric open. Once we have measured the size, at the length you require, cut inwards by 1 centimeter. Then just do it a bit faster with more force. Just tear it open here. The frayed edge torn like this. I think it is still relatively natural. If you feel that this frayed part isn't sufficient, then you can pull a few more threads out from the inside. You can do this according to your own preferences. The piece I have now is the one on the far left. It has 10 multiplied by 8 written on it. 10 corresponds to this vertical line. This horizontal line is 8. The bottom position is finished with raw edges, so the bottom position has no added treatment. The other 3 edges have a standard 5 millimeter margin applied, except for this piece. There is also this piece in the middle, and this piece on the far right. We are doing the fraying treatment at the bottom of these 3 pieces, so there's no need to leave them raw. The other 3 edges should have a 5 millimeter margin. Next, we have these 2 pieces. These two pieces are the same size. All 4 edges should have a 5mm margin. Let's discuss these 2 pieces again. These remaining parts, one have treated all of them with fraying. But this edge on top, you need to add the size of the design, although it has undergone fraying treatment. However, it also requires a certain style here, because we have finished everything here in the end. After the folding, the parts need to be stitched together. Anything that needs stitching definitely requires a style. All of these colored pieces of ours. Only the position at the bottom does not require modification. But if you need to fold it inward, you will need to add extra yourself. Then these 2 parts, their stitching and dimensions are the same. I will use one of the pieces here to demonstrate how it is stitched together. First, we have this piece at the bottom. We need to make a fold at this position. Folding here creates a double line fold on the left and right sides of the style line at a distance of 2mm each. First, create a crease line to widen it a bit. Here I use 4 moves forward and backward without reverting. Then we simultaneously tighten the 2 bottom lines. Take out the folds. One side feels tighter, then switch to the 2 bottom lines on the other side. After finishing the folds, it will match the size of the bottom edge of the upper part. The bottom edge is at this position. I will first draw the guideline for the bottom edge. The bottom edge is located at this position. Then we take the part we've just folded, place it directly over the bottom edge. Then we take out this piece of fabric next to it. At this moment, it's frayed edge. In other words, the bottom edge position. It all faces the left side. I place the drawing like this, vertically. This piece is this piece. Its bottom edge is located here. The piece next to it is this piece. Then we need to take this piece from below. After folding it up, we will assemble it with this one. Why do we have a piece of fabric next to us? It's because this edge is what we finished stitching here. It needs to be consistent with the edge next to it. The right and left sides. Both need to align perfectly with the adjacent side. After aligning the wheels, we move along this position, mark a line for it, fix these 2 pieces together. Please check it. If there are no issues with the stitching, we'll remove the gathering stitch in the front. Then at the seam we just created about 1 or 2 millimeters away from it, we'll sew another decorative line. You like this line of cars, don't you? And more cars. It's fine if you don't want any cars. It's simply for decoration. There are 2 lines like this. After sewing, we will compare this edge with the adjacent fabric again. Let's compare. Check if the dimensions are consistent. Then we repeat the steps. Use the same method to assemble this piece. Once everything is ready, we will use these 5 parts. Following the order specified in the blueprint, arrange them all correctly at once. Adjacent sides, sewing the front sides together. After sewing, we open this colored piece, the other side. This part is right next to it. Sew with the front sides together. After sewing, also open the colored pieces. Then continue sewing these 2 edges. The front sides should face each other. This colorful piece is being opened again, these 2 edges. Sewing the front sides together. After this last piece is sewn, our complete skirt piece is now finished. Then let's take a look at its back. These seams are stitched at these positions. If there are sisters who can overlock, then overlock all of them. Sisters who do not overlock, you can split it to both sides like this, then iron it flat. Next, we will take this position on both sides of the hem. Fold it inward along the seam line. Pull a thread from above, tuck in the edge a bit. The other side is also folded inward. Tuck in the edge a bit, then take the entire skirt hem, this edge that is swaying, fold it like this. Find the center point. Make a mark. The checked fabric may not be very clear. The center point is at this position. The purpose of creating marking points is, because of our skirt, it is made with patchwork, and it must be symmetrical on both sides. If marking points are not created, it's very likely that these positions will end up like this. For example, this flat connection position might have all shifted to the side, is also quite possible. So try to mark it as much as you can. Align. Of course, if you're confident in yourself, you can also skip making marking points. Then take the bottom edge of the upper part and fold it in half too. Find the center point. Make a mark. Wait a moment. The upper and lower sections. When they are connected together, the position of this center point, it needs to be aligned. Then let's proceed now. Let's pull a fold on the waist area. It's also a double line fold. The size after the fold is pulled. This bottom edge matches that of the upper part. The position dimensions are consistent. We need to position it facing each other. Make a stitch line along the bottom edge. Sew them together. The positions of the start and end, its edges, are all precisely aligned during the seam measurement process. First, regarding this central point, the markers need to be aligned. I used a clip myself. I clipped the center point. If you don't have a clip, using a bamboo needle is the same. Also, try to give it a chance here to achieve symmetry on both sides, specifically the position of each flat connection on the skirt board. A slight deviation will certainly be present. I'm just saying, don't be too outrageous. Be a bit more diligent, everyone. You can actually create more reference points. After the tests are completed, confirm that everything is fine. You can take out the basting stitches. Then I just finished measuring this seam. Those who can use an overlocker. Use an overlocking machine to finish the edges. After finishing the edges, turn it to the right side. The style at the bottom is directed to the left. We are measuring a visible line above, because I'm making a prototype garment here. So there is no overlocking here. I also said that at the start. This is the method for making a half inner scale. After finishing,